everyone, and welcome to this week's Salon, our regular gathering to discuss careers and research topics in the field of dementia research. You might not recognise me, I might be a new face to you. My name is Rebecca Williams, and I'm delighted to be your guest host for today's session. And it's fantastic to see so many of you joining us now. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope it'll be a fantastic session for you. This week, we're exploring the process of peer reviewing your first academic paper. And if you're anything like me who had to go through this process recently for the first time, then you know that even though peer review is one of the cornerstones of academic research, it can also be a real challenge to get a handle on. It's not only a way to ensure the quality and integrity of published research, but also a critical learning experience for reviewers themselves, especially early career researchers like myself. So whether you're an ECR like me or someone with experience looking to refine those skills, we hope today's session will explore how to balance constructive critique with sensitivity and respect, and let you provide feedback that is both impactful and professional. Always important to get that balance. So we're fortunate to have two fantastic speakers with us today. Up first is going to be Professor Diego Forero, who is a research leader and professor at the School of Health and Sports Sciences at Fundación Universitaria del Área Andina in Bogota, Colombia, a medical doctor with a PhD in biomedical sciences, because one MD wasn't enough. And Diego has authored over 130 international publications. Wow, and has extensive editorial and peer reviewing experience across high impact journals. So I'm sure his insights into the technical and ethical aspects of peer review are going to provide some incredibly valuable guidance for us all. And then following on, we'll have Dr. Rosie Jackson, who is recently a principal investigator at the University of Dundee. Well done, Rosie, where she focuses on exploring the impact of APOE4 on the brain in health and disease. Rosie brings a wealth of experience, having reviewed numerous papers and collaborated with researchers worldwide. So again, her perspective on fostering collaboration through thoughtful peer review will definitely be an excellent complement to today's discussion. If you haven't been to a salon before, what have you been doing? But here's how today's event is going to run. We'll start with a 30 to 40 minute live stream where we'll have each of our speakers share their thoughts for around 10 minutes. And then after that, I'll ask them a few questions to dig a little deeper into the topics. Once the talks end, the conversation will move to the online chat where our speakers will join you to answer your questions, share their tips, and hear about your experiences as well. So throughout the session, we really encourage you, please post your questions in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on that for you. This is your opportunity to ask our speakers about their expectations, seek advice, share your own insights. So please don't be shy about using that Q&A function. So with that, thank you very much again, everyone, for joining us today, especially our lovely speakers. Whether you're here to learn, share, or simply listen, all welcome. Everyone's presence really helps make these discussions just richer and more meaningful. And personally, let's say, as an early career researcher, I always love hearing about everyone's experiences of peer review. So with that, let's get started. Professor Diego Forero, would you like to share your screen for us and kick us off?
I will start, and thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction, and I'm really happy to be here in this presentation. I will do, as you mentioned, a short presentation, and after that we'll be really happy to answer the questions. So, first of all, I will share some of my experience, as you mentioned, as peer review. I have been peer review for almost 104 international journals, so it's a lot of journals, and I will share some experience about that. Starting, how to do a peer review, is important to have the knowledge of the structure of a manuscript or an article. I mean, to have some previous experience in how to write. That's useful when we start reviewing our first paper. As you see here, this is a paper we published some years ago on how to write manuscripts. And here in this figure, you see the overview of an original article. And usually for a peer reviewer, it's important these two sections, the methods and the results, because as you know, usually it's like the most important or challenging section to review because it's the center of the original paper. Here is a simple overview of the peer review process that is carried out in many journals. This is from a manuscript that's now submitted. This is another peer review international journal that you see here. We hope that will be published soon. And here, the author submit the manuscript. There is a screening by the editor. After that, there is a peer review by external experts. And depending on that, it can be rejected, or there is the opportunity for revision of the manuscript. And after that, it might be accepted or rejected, depending on the impact factor or other issues. Some journal has a higher rejection rate, and it depends on the specific journal and also on the paper. Here, there are some short recommendations. As you see here, this is an interesting paper from last year about how to become peer reviewer. And there are some recommendations. What is important is, for example, when we accept an invitation, it's important to be sure we have the time. For the editor, it's quite complicated when a scientist accepts the invitation to be reviewer, but is not able to do that. So, and you see, and you mentioned other important, for example, to be communicative, realistic, and also to have a respect for the authors of the paper, because we are all scientists. And here are some important concepts about peer review. Usually, this is like the most common, the single blind peer review. But we had also double blind, or we have more and more journal with open peer review. That is also this figure from our manuscript. Open peer review is quite important because we can have the content of the peer review, and in some cases also the identity of the peer reviewers, and for open science is quite important. Here are some recommendations. This is, I think, like the oldest paper about how to be a reviewer. And here you see some, and I will highlight two, to take into account that being a reviewer is also part of the publishing is quite important. And second, to enjoy and to learn from the reviewing process. In any manuscript, for every manuscript, we also learn a lot from the paper and also from the publishing processes. And here you see another recommendation from this paper, and it depends on the specific cases, the use of these recommendations. And here, that is, I think, quite important for early career scientists. As you can see, this paper was specifically aimed for early career scientists. Here is like a simple overview, hypothetical peer review report. You see here there is an introduction, and it's important to highlight the major issues and the minor issues. The major, for example, in this hypothetical case is related to sample size, and the minor issues is related more to the presentation of tables, reference, something that is not so high, so important or central as the major issues. In addition to that, also for early career scientists, as you can see here, this table number 2, there are many resources, training resources for early career scientists, for example, from COPE, also from the different publishers like Springer Nature, Elsevier Plus. So we had, the early career scientists had a lot of training resources to learn how to do a peer review. And in this moment, as you know, there is more people working in post-publication review. So it's leading a lot of retraction in specific topics. And you can see here, this is an example. For a scientist, it's really complicated to have a paper retracted. It's a huge challenge. And it's happening a lot more. And now with the artificial intelligence is another challenge, because, you know, it is recent, so we have more things to have guidelines about the use. This is from the International Committee on Medical Journals Editors, highlighting the importance of describing the use of artificial intelligence. And here, for example, we have some recent examples. You see, for example, from the year in which a paper was published and there was evidence of the use of artificial intelligence that was not reported in the paper. And you can see here, retraction was a lot of paper that had been found as possible use of artificial intelligence. So it's a huge challenge now for editors and also for peer reviewers. And as I mentioned, it's quite recent, so we need more guidelines about the use and also for the detections that you can see in this preprint about because in some cases there is evidence, and also from the paper, that some reviewers are using artificial intelligence for the reports. In some cases, it's not a good way to use artificial intelligence, because when an editor sends a manuscript to a peer reviewer, the idea is that that person with human experience do the evaluation, because as you know, artificial intelligence can have a lot of biases and other things. And that's my final slide. This was from a paper we published several years ago about the importance of resilience, because peer review, from the perspective of the authors, is related to resilience, and because for every peer review, the authors can improve the paper. That's the main idea of peer review, improving the manuscript. And this is my final slide, and thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. If anyone's got any questions on the back of that, please do put them in the Q&A or in the chat. If you don't mind, I'm going to take Chair's privilege and start off with one. It's such an interesting challenge about artificial intelligence and kind of large language models coming into the publishing sphere. Have you any advice for reviewers in spotting either words or even images that have been produced by these models?
Yes, now it's a huge challenge, because in many cases we need tools to do that. By the eye, or by a manual way, is quite difficult in some cases. In some cases, for example, the style can say something about that. Like in some cases in Spanish or English, there is a style that we can be suspicious about the use of artificial intelligence. But in many cases, we need tools. And now some companies are working with the tools. And as you mentioned, also with the figures, with the images, because in some cases it's easy, but in some cases it's not so easy to detect that. We need more tools, because by eye is really difficult, because it's maybe better with automatic tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to reading your paper on kind of reviewing manuscripts explicitly for early career researchers. I was curious if you could give us kind of the headline, if there was one top tip that you could give to early career researchers as they're reviewing their first paper, what would it be?
Yes, the first one for me will be to look the peer review as peer review, because for some early career scientists, they say, oh, so that's too much work, I need to write a lot of recommendations. And it's different when you see that as a peer review. You say, I need to do some recommendations, but I don't need to write a lot, because that's the role for the author. So it's different, because in some cases the early career scientists feel overwhelmed, because they see that's a lot of work, because they try to see more like trying to collaborate or to say something or to write a lot. And when we see that as a peer review, we see it's a shorter or easier work than doing or writing a lot, because the long writing is for the authors, not for the reviewers.
Very good. That's really helpful, actually. As a self-proclaimed waffler, I think, especially in peer review, it's really helpful to know that conciseness can be key, as with so many things in academia. Yes. I can't see any other questions at the minute in the chat, but if you have any, please do keep posting them there. And like I say, we'll get the chance at the end as well to move this conversation into the chat. With that, I think I'll take us over to Rosie. Rosie, would you like to carry us on with your presentation on peer review?
Absolutely. Okay, I will just share my screen. Great.
Fantastic. Okay. We can see that fine. Thank you.
Okay. So I thought I would carry on from Diego's chat about why we peer review and all of the important factors of peer review. And so what is the point of peer review anyway? So peer review is designed to evaluate the paper's quality and suitability for publication. These are pulled directly from various journals' websites on how to peer review. Assess the validity, quality, and often the originality. And most importantly, especially in regards to ChatGPT and image falsification, it's to safeguard the quality and integrity of scholarly research. There's nothing worse than basing a whole project off of a paper that you read and then learning that that paper was based on shoddy assumptions. It's also just important while you're peer reviewing to remember what's not your job. And it's not your job to copy edit the paper. Spelling and grammar are not your job. Of course, if you find spelling errors, you find grammar errors, those are very useful to point out. But you're not there to make sure that someone's English is correct. And it's also not your job to ensure the authors have answered every single question in the field. Peer review often comes under criticism for being too comprehensive in the things that the reviewers want authors to do. So getting started, this is sort of my how-to guide. So the first thing you want to do when you get your paper to peer review is read it and make sure that you don't have any conflicts. If you do have conflicts, mention them immediately, turn it back to the editor and apologize. But assuming there are no conflicts, you're going to read the paper the full way through without taking any sort of detailed notes. Just give it a quick read and think to yourself, what is the main question asked in this paper? And what are the main conclusions? And in that first read through, are there any major flaws? So the main question, the things you want to be thinking about with the main question is this an interesting area? Is it relevant to the journal's scope? Is it novel or original? Are the conclusions supporting or important for the main question? Are they supported by the data presented? And are they related to the question being addressed? And then any major flaws could include things like drawing a conclusion that's contradicted or not supported by the results of the paper, ignoring a process or an area of the literature that's related to the paper's aims, using a method that's not appropriate, or if you're unable to understand what the main questions or conclusions are of the paper, that's a major flaw. And all of these things will sort of prop to your head as you read it through quickly the first time. And then you're going to write your first paragraph. So Diego posted a really nice example of, you have a paragraph and then we have major flaws, minor flaws. That's how most reviews are written, and they're very useful in that way. But when you write the first paragraph, you want to focus on the who, the what, and the how. The who's not terribly important, but it's just nice to, Jackson et al. Did this. And then what you're going to say is, so Jackson et al. Looked at this process using these methods. And what this tells the author, the editor, yourself, is that you've understood the purpose and the point of the paper. It helps the editor know whether or not the paper is in their scope, and it should give them some indication as to whether or not the originality and the novelty of the paper is where they want it to be. You're also in that first paragraph going to summarize any major concerns you have about the paper, like truly major. And then mention if you have other sort of major or minor concerns. You want to mention if it's interesting and novel. This is the place to say it's out of scope for the journal. It shouldn't be. That really is the editor's job to decide whether or not a paper is in or out of scope. But if you believe that the paper is totally out of scope for the journal that you are editing for, you can say that. It's very important the whole way through the peer review process. Don't be rude. Don't be unkind, but you do need to make your point. Don't dissemble. Don't couch all of your words in, unnecessary nice words. You want to say what you want to say, respectfully. If it's a great paper, say it's a great paper. Like if you read the paper and you think this is amazing, this is so cool, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd written this paper, say that. It's always nice to give positive feedback. It's always nice to read positive feedback. And importantly, don't get too hung up at this stage. You will probably come back and edit this paragraph. And these paragraphs look a little bit like this. And this is a lot of text. I get that. I sort of color-coded it to be the who, what, how. And I've pulled these directly from Nature Communications, which holds an open review peer review process. And so these are real reviews written by real people about real papers that got published. It's very hard to find an example of a peer review for a paper that doesn't get published, but that isn't, what I wrote. But here we have sort of the authors present impressive work on uncovering, so the authors, the who, present impressive work on uncovering the molecular mechanisms of urea channels and inhibition mechanisms. That's the what, with a series of high-resolution structures, molecular dynamics, and biophysical assays. That's the how. And then they say, this manuscript is great, however, I have serious reservations. The next one down, I'm not going to read it all out, but, again, they have the who, they have the what, and they have the how. And at the end, they say it's well written, high quality study, critical insights, some shortcomings. So that's probably some minor concerns, maybe a major concern or two that they have. And then this last one I wrote just as an example of a maybe slightly more negative review, because again, as I said, it was very hard to find real ones. So in this one, this hypothetical paper, I would like to stress it is hypothetical. Jackson et al., who did this thing by this method, the paper is well written, the results are supported, however, the novelty is lacking, right? And that's sort of, you say that, you don't say that that prevents the publication, because that is an editor's decision, but it is your job to bring that up if you have found or know of other results in the literature that are very similar. And then major concerns are noted below. So after you do that, the next steps are to read the paper again incredibly thoroughly, paying close attention to the methods, the figures, and the data. You want to make sure that the conclusions are supported by the data presented. So as Diego showed, that middle section, the results and the methods become your main job as a reviewer. You want to make sure that the conclusions are supported. You want to make sure the stats are appropriately done and the methodology is sound. And while you're doing this, you're going to take note of anything that is inappropriately or incorrectly done. And these will probably be major concerns. So stats that are done wrong, inappropriate method use, and not high enough, anything like that. You can also take notes of anything that make the understanding or the interpretation of the data more difficult, and these will often be minor concerns. So axis is labeled incorrectly, weird phrasings of words, figures are too small, things like that. Your minor concerns shouldn't include things that you just don't like. So if you would prefer for your figures to be a different color, then that's not something you should be mentioning. But if they make it difficult to understand the data, for example, if the color of your X group keeps changing figure on figure and you think it would be way more interpretable to hold that as the same color, you can mention that. Things to consider while you're doing this. Again, I can't stress enough that the job of a reviewer is to make sure that the methods and the results are appropriate and support the conclusions that are presented in the paper. So again, you need to check that the methods are detailed, that they are appropriate, and they are correctly applied. If no, is there something they can do to mitigate this? Are the statistics appropriate and correctly applied? Are the graphs that are presented appropriate for the stats that are done? Things to look for here are things like pseudo-replication, non-normal data, weird axis numbering, and does the number of dots on a graph equal the n number that's being presented? And one of the reasons why it's so important to look at figures closely is, we have, heads up, there we go. Here's our Western blot, and you can see this is obviously hypothetical, but you have your real results, your expected results, and then all sorts of other weird results. If you look at the Western blot and you think that's too good to be true, really think carefully about whether or not you want to make that a confidential comment to the editor. If Western blots should be full Western blots provided, depending on what the journal wants, then again, this is the time to mention that. And it's things like this that an editor or a reviewer can catch and that can change a paper quite dramatically. So you can see here, you've got the same data in both of these two graphs, but a different y-axis. And that different y-axis dramatically changes the interpretation of the results that you would get from sort of glancing at this figure. And these are the sorts of things that should get picked up at review. Other things, changes in immunohistochemistry background in figures, bleed through, like I said, full Western blots. And at the end of the day, it's your job to make sure that the data presented back up the written claims of the paper and that the conclusions are grounded in the data. And that this research is presented in the context of the wider field. So again, have they ignored an area of the field because it contradicts their findings? Are the limitations of the paper presented appropriately in the written area of the discussion and the conclusion? So here are some top tips for peer review. Number your comments. If you can refer to specific lines, that's very, very helpful. And this just makes life so much easier for authors, for editors, for you when this comes back from review and you're trying to figure out why you said what you said. Turn it in on time. Don't accept reviews that you don't have the time to do. It just makes everyone angry. and it's not a good part of this whole process. Again, you need to be polite but firm. Something to think about as you're reading your way through the paper is if it would get pinged at Journal Club, you should bring it up in your review. If it's the sort of thing that you think that around pizza, around the Terranville, someone would say, oh, I don't understand why that graph goes with that picture. That doesn't make any sense to me. Then you can bring that up. And you can say, I don't quite understand how the figures, the images that you are showing, your representative images, don't seem to be supported by the graph that you are showing. Perhaps you should choose new representative images. If you don't know something, that's okay. You may only be an expert in half the paper, and you can say that. You can say, I'm so sorry, I'm not an expert in RNA-seq. However, that data looks good to me. I am an expert in this thing, and these are my problems with it. And at the end of the day, it's important to remember that it's not about making the best paper. It's about ensuring that the paper is good enough for publication. So I'm sure another 5 experiments would be interesting, but are they necessary to prove the point that is trying to be proven? So just quickly, how to get started on a peer review. Most people get started on a peer review by a mentor offering them kind of a ride along. So, your PI is asked to peer review this paper and they say, would you like to help me? If that isn't happening, find a mentor, a senior postdoc, someone in the lab next door who you are comfortable asking for help, and say, it'll take you 20 minutes, just let me help you. And then try and do it yourself, and then just compare your peer review with the mentor's peer review and see how you differ and see how you're similar. Some journals now provide a space for credit to be given to co-reviewers, and that's becoming more and more popular, in part because journals are more and more desperate for reviewers, and then they have your email address forever. If you don't have a mentor that you trust to allow you to do this, Brain Communications, the journal, has a reviewer academy. I've put the link in there. Thank you, Rebecca. And that can be a very valuable mechanism by which you can gain peer review experience. They will assign you a mentor and they will help you with your first peer review process. That's everything from me right now. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I particularly love that tip about the journal club. I've never thought about reviewing that way, but that's such a helpful anchor to me of what kind of things to be pointing out. As always, questions for Rosie, if you pop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on those. In the meantime, I was curious, Rosie, you mentioned kind of this open peer review becoming kind of more normalized, of like people putting their names to reviews. This is something I found quite scary, of this idea of, someone being able to see what I've said about their paper. What are your thoughts on kind of opening up this peer review process? Oh boy.
Well, who am I? But, my personal thoughts is that I'm very happy with the peer review process becoming more open, and with peer reviews being published alongside articles. I think that helps. First of all, it helps people who don't know how to peer review something. They can go and they can read 20 of these and see what other people have thought and how other people write peer reviews. However, I am very reluctant to sign up to any sort of system whereby you put your name as a reviewer on the review itself. I think that it creates a system whereby the little guy gets knocked or feels as though they could be penalized for saying what they think when you're reviewing a paper from a much larger lab. However, and I cannot stress this enough, if you would not put your name to something as a comment, you shouldn't say it, right? And I mean that in terms of like, if you knew it was never going to affect your career, but you still wouldn't sign up to say it, don't say it. Don't use the peer review process of anonymity to be rude, to be unkind. There is nothing worse than the 3-page review that comes in right before Christmas where they do nothing but bash you for the full 3 pages. It creates tears and tantrums, and it most of the time these are coming back to PhD students and postdocs, and they have poured their heart and soul into this paper for the last 3 years. Don't be the problem. You know, be the solution. I think that's an important thing to think about while you're peer reviewing. You don't want to be the problem. You want to be the solution. And if you know, if it's a terribly done paper, then there are ways to say that politely. There are ways to point out the things that got done wrong without resorting to sort of more personal attacks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which
we've
happened.
got a comment. Yeah, we've got a comment that's just thank you, that was really useful, which I completely agree with. My other slight question is, you mentioned, and this is something I've heard before, that kind of the reviewing process is not copy editing, but also that highlighting areas that are phrased weirdly or that make the research kind of more inaccessible is something that is kind of your responsibility as a reviewer. So I was just wondering if you had any comments on kind of where to find that line between what is kind of copy editing versus trying to make the paper more accessible.
Sure. I would say that for my personal preference, so I'm a native English speaker, so I have all of those advantages, and I recognize that. However, the paper needs to be able to be understood, right? Because the whole point of a paper is, it's all about remembering what is the salient point of this thing? And the point is to communicate your research with the world. Mm-hmm. If the paper written does not effectively do that to you as an expert in the field with maybe 2 read-throughs, then it is inappropriately written for the world, right? So I am an expert in APOE biology. If I can't understand what you're trying to say, then the paper needs to be rewritten. That doesn't mean the experiments need to be redone, but the paper needs to be rewritten. So, and the same is true of figures, right? If I look at your figure and I can't understand what you're trying to tell me with that figure, then the figure needs to be rejigged somehow. Again, the experiments maybe don't need to be redone. It's, you know, it could just be a minor comment, but if I don't understand what you're trying to tell me, then that's when you bring those things up as a reviewer to the editor and to the authors. You know, it took me 9 reads to understand what you were going, and now that I get it, I love it. But it can't take me 9 reads because you're going to lose. No one else is going to put that time and effort in.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Speaking of very quickly, kind of on 9 reads, gosh, I hope it doesn't take that long. But how long do you usually spend reviewing a paper? I understand it depends on the paper and maybe the journal, but what's a good kind of starting timeline to aim for?
Okay, so for your first paper, it's going to take you 6 hours. That's okay. Hold on to that. Remember, your first Western blot took you 9 hours. Now it takes you 2. Like, just remember that as you practice things, you'll get better at them. I would say that for me now, I like to do my peer reviews over 2 sessions, basically. So I'll do my first read, my first paragraph, couple major comments, couple minor comments, and then I'll put it aside and I won't do my deep dive read. I'll let it sit with me for a day, and that's just my own personal choice. So I tend to do a 1 hour, 2 hour block, or maybe a half hour, 2 hour block. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert at peer review. I haven't done thousands in the way Diego has. So maybe he's gone down that timeline a little bit further, and now it takes him 45 minutes and he can bash out a review. But I think that you should be dedicating time to this, to the point that you're deep diving. It's a deep dive into a paper. And that's one of the beautiful things about peer review. It's one of the benefits to the peer reviewer. You will almost never read a paper in the depth that you read it for peer review. And that's, it helps you solidify your own opinions on how your science should be done, and all of that. And that's kind of really one of the benefits that you get from peer review. I don't know if Diego has a point to make on that one.
About that, as you mentioned, usually with the time is shorter because of other experience. But as you mentioned, also depends on the paper and the journal and all that. But as you mentioned, it's just important to have that time. Usually, in more than one session, it's quite difficult to do that in only one session because as you mentioned, you read and a second until reading improve the recommendations on the paper. And in some cases now, for example, to share some of my recent experience as peer reviewer with some paper mills. We didn't talk about the paper mill, but it's a huge challenge for me as peer reviewers and editor because these papers have been produced by companies. And usually when we receive that, we see that. And usually in these cases, the time to review is shorter because we identify huge problems in a short time. But it's happening. We hope that it stops, but I find quite common as reviewers and editor, papers coming from paper mills.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess a final question for you, Diego. As Rosie said, as someone who's got a lot of experience reviewing, have you noticed your style of reviewing kind of change as you've been going?
Yes, it has changed. When I started, I tried to do a long number of comments, and now with the time I am trying to be shorter in my comments, to be more concise, and to have like the general recommendation, because I think that is the role for the authors to do all the work. So, and for me, going from a long list of recommendation and moving to a shorter and more concise recommendation. It has changed my style.
Yeah, if I could jump in there. I mean, the first peer review I ever wrote, my comment list was ungodly, and my and was like, "That you can't do that." And thankfully, I had a supervisor who was like, "No, no, they're going to find you. They're going to kill you." Your job is not to find every single problem with this paper. Your job is to find the problems that mean that it is sort of incorrectly done. You're not trying to find, like I said, you're not trying to find every typo. You're not trying to find things that could be done better. Is it good enough? And if it isn't good enough, then you need to say it. You need to shout it. But if it's good enough, and it's done well, and they're proving their point, then that's, you can let it go that they used qPCR instead of, a microarray, or that they used fact sorting instead of immunohistochemistry, or whatever it is. There may be the best way to do something. That doesn't always mean it's the only way to do something.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, I think that's a great place to close our session for today and move to the online chat. I think this has been really useful for me. I think perfectionism is something that a lot of us deal with in academia, and this idea of keeping things concise, keeping comments realistic, I think is a really helpful thing to keep in mind moving forward. And also remembering that, like everything in academia, peer reviewing is a skill that you will learn, that you will hone as you go on, and making sure that you do reach out and ask for help from mentoring schemes, from supervisors, from more experienced reviewers, to really help you hone that skill in the most efficient way possible. Fantastic. In that case, as I say, we'll move over to the online chat. If you've got any questions or your experiences of peer review, any big learning curves that you've had, if you've started doing peer review, we'd love to hear about them and get some discussion going. All right, with that, see you, folks. Thank you very much again to our amazing speakers. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much.
All right, see ya.
Bye.
Sorry, I should say, if you want, you can turn your cameras off and just reply to things in the chat. It can be the best way forward.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, Rebecca, can we answer these out loud? Poor Diego's been typing for like 10 minutes, and I feel like it's be quicker just to answer these questions.
That's fine.
Yes, sure. Do you want to start?
No, go for it. Go for it.
Yes, I was mentioning some cases, for example, for some early career scientists, it's kind of intimidating when they review a paper from a very famous scientist. They say, oh, it's very difficult. And in my case, I had several experience when the paper was not so good, and I included that because, as you mentioned, we know it's not so important the name of the fame of the authors as the quality. As we know that the quality is not good, it's not important like the fame or the name of the authors, but the quality. Because maybe in some cases the early career scientists are intimidated by that. It's one of the examples.
Yeah, and then my feeling a little bit on the lots of comments thing. I don't think it's bad to not have lots of comments. I mean, if the paper's great, then your review can be like, the paper's great. All the questions got answered. You know, you don't need to have anything negative to say. It's not about finding the problem. It's about whether or not the paper is good and whether or not they have proven the things that they are saying. So no, it's not bad to not have a lot of comments. However, if you don't have a lot of comments, but your major comment is that the methods are totally inappropriate then you can have one comment and it can be a recommend for rejection. So, or you can have 100 comments and be like, the paper's, I would recommend minor corrections and a resubmission. So it really, really is dependent on the paper itself. Don't have 100 comments. I just said Diego wins. Don't have 100 comments. But that's, yeah.
Yes, I had a comment about that. In some cases, maybe the reviewer don't know so many things about the paper, and in some cases, for example, he or she doesn't have the expertise, for example, in statistical analysis, and the reviewer can say, I don't know about that. Maybe you need to look to another expert to have another comments. Quite important, and also because in some cases we try to think that we know all about the papers, and in some cases it's important to say to the editor, I know about this, but I don't know about that, so it's better to look for specific expert on that. And in my case, I remember, Rosie, I had as an author a manuscript that was published almost 10 years ago, and I had more than 100 comments. So the revised paper was a lot of several weeks, but it was really good because it has a lot of citation because of that, but it was a lot of work because it was more than 100 comments. And about the question of Rebecca about the improvement of the own research, I think that's quite important because in many cases, as you mentioned, Rosie, reading a manuscript as a peer reviewer teaches not only about the specific paper, but also some standards in the field. So yes, in my case, I think that has been improving, for example, in using a standard for reporting and others. So, and that's what the reasons I accept the invitation to be a peer reviewer, because I learn and I improve my own research being a peer reviewer.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I mean, it's one of those things where you are writing something and you take a beat and then you come back to it and you're like, why did that's not legit. What am I doing here? Or more importantly, the space I found my writing to get better from peer review or from being a peer reviewer is in my discussion and my conclusion, because at the end of the day, I'm presenting the results that in the way that I think is best. And so obviously I think that they're the most appropriate. But it's also in the, in the pointing out of the ensuring that my research is being put into the context of the wider field. That was something that I maybe didn't do so well in my earlier career. And because I sort of assumed that everyone knew all of the things that I knew, because I assumed as an early career researcher that I didn't know anything and everyone was smarter than me. And after becoming a peer reviewer and reading other people's and being like, oh, well, why didn't they mention this paper? They should have mentioned this paper. This paper is really important for what they're trying to say. It made me appreciate a lot more that you've got to talk about the things that you've got to, in ways that are sort of commensurate with the literature. And that was something I learned very specifically from peer review, was when and where it is very important to bring up previous research in the discussion.
Fantastic. I can't see any more comments coming through or anyone typing. So if anyone has any final questions, I'll give you a solid 30 seconds to get them typed out for Rosie and Diego before we end the stream there.
All right, so do you want the answers in the chat for like online reasons?
It's up to you, and the session will be recorded. So it's up to you whether you want to put them in the chat as well, or just have them, just have your answers is both fine. Thank you.
A question, Rosie, for you. Yes, because we were discussing our recent paper about the importance of improving the participation of female scientists in peer review, because when we see the statistics, less female scientists are invited or accepting the invitation. How do you see how to improve that?
Oh boy, how to improve it? Jesus, I don't know. I will say that I think one of the problems facing women in peer review is this natural, or not natural, but this learned tendency, this sort of societal expectation of perfectionism. And especially in a career that is male dominated, where you fight a little bit more to be a woman in science. I'm not suggesting that the men don't have to fight to be here too, but it is, it's a thing. That feeling of never quite knowing everything or enough to be able to comment on a paper that is maybe just slightly outside of your field of expertise. So the same is true of women applying to jobs, right? Men will apply to jobs on average if they fulfill 50% of the required expectations, and women will only apply if they fulfill 80 to 90% of the required expectations of that job. The same is true, I think, in peer review. And it's this idea that you must be an expert in absolutely every aspect of the paper or you couldn't possibly comment. And I think what's very important, and what you've said, what I've said, is that's not true. You can be an expert in 50% of the paper and tell the editor, I don't know enough about X, Y, and Z to make a comment on that part. But I know enough, I know loads about A, B, and C, and my comments on this part of the paper are very, very valuable to the field. So I think that it is highlighting that from editorial point of view that you're good enough, your comments are valuable, and you don't need to know absolutely everything in order to be very valuable to the review process. That's my 2 cents. I mean,
Yes.
I think we'll draw it to a close there on that lovely note that I think applies to CRs as well, of just because you don't feel like you're an expert on the topic yet doesn't mean that you don't have value to add to the scientific field. And I think it's a common fear we have, is that we'll be editing papers, or reviewing papers I should say, and writing comments that don't make sense or that aren't really valid. So I think this has been really helpful in one, kind of increasing confidence that you are an expert. If you're an expert in 50% of the paper, you absolutely have the right and should engage with that review process. Keep your expectations realistic, both for other people's research and for yourself as the reviewer. We've heard here over 100 comments, not what anyone wants, So keep it concise where you can.
That's what people need.
Yeah.
Just to highlight.
Depending on yes.
100 comments, and it makes the paper the best paper ever. And sometimes that's just what it takes.
So yeah, thank you both so much. Thank you everyone for joining us as well. I hope you will have a fantastic day, and hopefully we'll see you again, Diego and Rosie, soon on another salon.
Sure.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.